Hello, and welcome back to the Video Essay Podcast. I'm your host, Will DeGravio. Today's episode features a conversation with Daniel Chávez Heras, recorded live in May at the King's Festival of Artificial Intelligence in London. The event featured as the launch of Cinema and Machine Vision, Artificial Intelligence, Aesthetics, and Spectatorship, a new book by Daniel from Edinburgh University Press. We talk about the themes and topics covered in the book, the intersections of AI and film studies, and answer audience questions. You will notice that my audio in the recording has a little bit of an echo, but luckily Daniel, he sounds great, which is obviously the most essential part of this. I must say that I found Daniel's book really fascinating and very accessible. It's very much an interdisciplinary book, sitting at the intersections of film studies, critical technology studies, digital humanities, and more. And especially for folks like myself with a film studies background, I found it to be a really great way into the many questions regarding AI today. Daniel, who is a lecturer in digital culture and creative computing at King's College London, also has an interest in videographic criticism. Just earlier this year, he published an article in the journal Convergence, in which explores the idea of computational supercuts and video essays. And in 2012, he contributed an article to the first issue of Frame's Cinema Journal, which was edited by Catherine Grant under the title Film and Moving Image Studies Reborn Digital? And that issue features some foundational texts, including many early examples of scholarly thinking about what we now call videographic criticism. So Daniel and his work really make a natural fit for this podcast, and I'm very grateful that he asked me to join him in London and help launch his book. Daniel has also generously agreed to give away 2 copies of his book to listeners. You can learn more about that process at the link in the podcast description. As always, you can learn more about this show at thevideoessay.com. And now here's my conversation with Daniel. Marking the official launch of his book. So a round of applause to you. And so I
anticipated, considering that I haven't said anything.
We're starting enough high. Feel free to applaud at any point throughout the evening. So this book has a beautiful cover, which you were telling me about over lunch, and you can all see in front of you here. If you're listening to the podcast, hopefully you clicked on the episode and can see a copy of this image. But I want to ask you to share with the audience here how this cover image, well, first of all, what is it? And second, how did it come about?
Yeah, thank you. It looks like an ominous eye that's looking at us, but it is in fact some kind of data visualization. There's 7 rings, and each ring is a movie barcode or a visualization of color frames from different decades of BBC archive television. This is based on an open data set of British television, so the innermost ring is the 1930s, and it goes all the way up to the 1990s. So I will also tell you the reason why the cover is there and not another. I wanted to do an AI cover. I had done this before for another book from a very esteemed colleague, another great book called Algorithmic Reason. And that was a couple of years ago, I think maybe 2-3 years ago. And that was fine. It was one of these very early images, GAN images that were a bit, on that style, say, kind of AI generated images, and it was all fine. And then 2 years later, when I approached this publisher with the idea of doing AI cover, they were very, very gracious and very kind, but they said, no, we cannot do these now. There are all sorts of legal reasons why we're not allowed to do this. And I told, well, we did this 2 years ago. And they said, well, yes, but the world is different now. and so the reason I wanted an algorithmic generated image for the book, but it couldn't be AI. So it has nothing to do with AI. It's just an algorithmically generated visualization of a few decades of British television. That's what the cover image is.
Yeah. You talk about the changing landscape of artificial intelligence in relation to cinema and how much it's changed even the last 2 years with the cover of your book. And I feel like when I think about artificial intelligence in cinema, I think of like the workers' strikes and like the threats to labor in the film industry. I think about just this week, you may have seen Scarlett Johansson, it seems, might be gearing up for a lawsuit against Sam Altman's company for using a likeness of her voice. There was that recent movie, Late Night with the Devil, that used a couple of brief artificial intelligence generated images, and then there were boycotts. So we're kind of gathering at a very interesting time for the relationship between artificial intelligence and cinema, and yet your book, I think, paints a very nuanced portrait that tries to tackle this from a bunch of different areas. And so I think before we get into that conversation, it's good to just establish a few, kind of a common language for talking about this just this evening. And so what is machine vision, and how does it relate to cinema? We'll go right to the title of your book.
Right, yes. So when I was thinking about the title as well, and obviously been thinking about machine vision for a while, I think if you read the kind of more technical machine learning, AI literature on machine vision, it has a very defined meaning. But also when you talk with film people and photography people and arts and humanities people, that meaning kind of expands a little bit. So one of the interesting aspects of machine vision, of this definition of machine vision, is that we've been actually using machines for expanding or augmenting our vision for a long time, right? So we've had this, ancient civilizations using water-filled orbs to modify vision as an augmentation devices, spectacles, in the 1200s, in 1600s, telescope, microscope, right, all the way up to the photographic camera. And obviously the 20th century, the century of cinema, so to speak, you have a machine, a mechanism that modified, reshaped vision and visual culture dramatically during the 20th century and to the first century. And these are all machines. So the notion that machine vision is only begins or only starts with computers, with digital computers, is part of the reason, but it's part of the book in a sense. So part of the book is about the earlier history of machine vision and how it connects to what we now understand as machine vision, which is a larger. To me, it was a larger term that comprises computer vision as the latest version of this, right? So, of course, since digital computers, you get cameras attached to computers, and then you get this notion of computer vision, kind of the last part of this long history of devices we use to modify or alter or augment vision. So that's more or less where the notion of machine vision came from. I had other titles, but I think that one prompted. I think it equally intrigued some computer scientist colleagues and also some humanities colleagues. So I went with that one.
It's very useful to have a term like this because I think depending on everyone in the room, our levels of familiarity with AI and machines, we kind of all have this feeling that they're seeing us and feeling us. And I think it's a quite interesting thing to try and negotiate what exactly that means and how it makes us feel. Another phrase that you set out early in the book that kind of sent some chills up my spine was this idea of the computational gaze. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on, for folks here, what is the computational gaze as you understand it?
Yeah. Also to talk about this earlier part of the book, some of these notions have a very rich background in different disciplines. What I found as I was writing it as well, depending on who you asked, they would have different beginnings or different starting stories as to how it all started or began in some sense. So the one author that I kind of picked upon to build my arguments on top was Paul Virilio and his vision machine. And he was talking about this notion of the computational gaze, or some kind of abstracted computational system that would see for us, and that we would have a complete representational view of the visual field. But of course, he wrote about this more of as a philosophical quibble, right? He wanted to, it was a thought experiment. He was never really thinking about these systems being, he said that they were going to become actual machines later in the future. More or less at the same time as he was doing this in '94, there was already a lot of computer vision research that was happening in a different discipline. So in a sense, he was both ahead of his time and already of his time, and probably behind his time all at the same time. No, so the notion of the computational gaze is this idea that you have as computer systems that see on your behalf, that have seen for you, even though you have not seen things directly yourself. No, so in that sense, it is slightly different, for example, from a telescope or a microscope, in which your eyes is still at the other end of the device. So you can think about this computational gaze as a larger socio-technical system that's distributed, that depends on global network computation, but at the same time, there is necessarily not just one person looking at the other end, at either end actually. So it's a lot of large groups of people looking at other large groups of people mediated through global computation. Yeah, that's broadly speaking, the notion that Virilio was aiming for, I think.
Yeah. It's some very useful terminology to kind of make our way through this conversation that you set out at the beginning of the book. And throughout the book, you make reference to Made by Machine, When AI Met the Archive, which was a 2018 experimental television program produced by the BBC that you were involved in. Mm-hmm. And I think you have a clip for us to play. So I think it would be helpful to watch the clip and then ask some questions, and then to continue to have some common language. I will say briefly, please be thinking of questions that you may have for Daniel at the end of this conversation. The best question will win a prize, and I'm not joking. So be thinking now, and then we'll reserve the last 20 minutes or so for questions.
I will be told the prize so we can calibrate the question.
The prize. Can we reveal the prize? Will be a copy of this beautiful book to take home with you.
Calibrate my question.
Please do.
You can also have dinner with me if you want that.
The prize will be an extra glass of free wine at the end. Yeah. So what we've just watched is a clip from the project for which you and your colleagues took over, I believe it was over 15,000 clips from the BBC archive.
Yes.
And essentially used AI to go through and identify those clips and then create what became the experimental television program. Is that correct? And could you tell us more about the project and its origins?
That is correct. I mean, those of you who know me, or some students that I see in the audience may have seen this clip or know about this project before. This was in 2018, and the idea was to use BBC R&D was experimenting with machine learning techniques to try to understand its holdings and the vast archive that they have. And what initially was going to be a very small project that was going to be on one of their websites turned out, it eventually grew into this kind of full-scale TV program that aired in 2018 in BBC4. And it was a fantastic experiment on trying to lay bare the inner workings of machine vision. Looking at it now, it seems both a bit naive in some sense, but also it's almost historical, even though it hasn't been that long. It looks a bit like some of these ideas about predicting the next sequence, the next token in a sequence, and connecting images with words are very much at the heart of what we now understand to be generative AI. So this was generative television back in 2018, if you want. It was very imperfect in so many ways, but some of the ideas that animated it kind of are run throughout the book, and this is the reason I've given it a special place in the book, I think. It helps with, especially with the first chapters, to launch kind of the discussions that come later, but it's also a piece of recent history, if you want. So that's where the project came from. That was the idea.
Mm. In the book, you talk about this project in relation to the difference between archives and data sets. And you draw certain connections between the two, but also note that they have very different kind of ambitions, right? An archive, there are archivists at the BBC who are labeling clips and shows, maybe sorting them into genre and year, and type of program, whereas a machine is dealing with a data set in a very different way. Describe, for folks listening in here in the room, the difference between the two and how you parse through them in relation to this project and the book generally.
Well, one of the interesting aspects of data sets, especially when they're used for machine processes, for machine learning, but for AI in general, is that they modify the representations in such a way that the representations become almost indistinguishable from what they represent, from what they went before. So if you have images or moving images, instead of having something that you can look at and say this is a frame of a film, you end up with a bunch of numbers, with a tensor, with this kind of matrix-like representation that has nothing to do with images, that is unrecognizable as an image. And this is true of many other things. The same thing goes for text and for many other applications. The key thing about data sets used for this type of processing is that they fragment and kind of atomize the world. They break it into very tiny pieces, and that's part of the success of machine learning also as an endeavor, which is it transforms the world in such a way that it preserves something from the world, something from whatever it is that is representing, but at the same time it makes it so that a machine can then process it as matrix of numbers using GPU hardware, for example, the sort of things that you have on gaming computers. So as it turns out, your gaming computer had a different use case if you play games. So this is making it into that language, stripping it from many layers of symbolic trappings is what makes this possible. Whereas in traditional archival practice, you're almost thinking about the opposite. You're creating these taxonomies, hierarchies, ways to facilitate retrieval, to facilitate interrogation of archives by people. So in some sense, part of the argument I make in that earlier chapter is that these data sets are not made for people. They're never meant to be seen by people, whereas archives, in some sense, are designed for researchers, for general publics, for commercial purposes, to be browsed and explored by people. And the types of operations that you have to effect on data sets and on archives are actually quite different. It's almost like they derive their value from the exact opposite operation sometimes. It's almost like for one to become valuable, it needs to become really different from the human representation. And for the other one to be valuable, it needs to get close to some kind of human schema with which you can then process it or access it. So that was kind of the intention of that earlier distinction.
Earlier, you made reference to the interdisciplinary nature of this book, and you talk about that a lot at the beginning, where it's drawing from film studies, critical technology studies, digital humanities, and one of the points that you make in the book is that, in this age of AI and in technology, every single moving image that is produced at this point is also a data set. And I think you kind of lay out a challenge to folks like myself who come from a film studies background to really think about this and the implications of this and how AI can be a tool to understand this and make sense of these data sets. Is that correct? And I'm wondering if you could just speak more generally to your ambitions to write a book that really transcends disciplines in that way.
I think interdisciplinary work is really interesting to me. I'm myself kind of a mixed background, so when I was thinking about studying and what to do, I was told in general by computer people that I like films too much in some sense, and vice versa, right? So film people were thinking, you like computers too much to be a film scholar. So in some sense, I think digital humanities was a nice house for me to do this type of interdisciplinary work. Now, interdisciplinary work is hard. It's not, it's really nice in theory, and it gets talked about in tenure committees and all the rest of it. But when it comes to actually borrowing methods and tools, funding from other disciplines, this is a difficult type of work, and this attracted me quite a bit. And this is part, to go back to your question about the book. Partly the idea of writing a book, it was to give kind of an arts and humanities focus on discourses around AI. And this was also part of the reason it ended up being a book as opposed to many different articles as well. I wanted it to have a longer shelf life, to have to kind of engage these debates beyond the kind of the really fast-paced environment where AI is usually discussed, where the state of the art changes almost every day, and you have new tools coming out, every day, and almost every week you have some kind of, it's in the news for one reason or another. And this is obviously the pace of technological development, but it's also it blinds us to other larger, wider debates, and it also makes us really vulnerable to hype in some sense, but also to manipulation. So you get AI discourses that try to kind of instill fear about things that will probably not happen for another 100 years, or that may never happen at all, and neglect some of the real concerns that are actually happening now, that AI poses to society now. And this warping of reality is obviously there because you have billion-dollar industries that depend on this. So this is in my mind. I was also thinking about a book that could maybe have a bit of a longer life, and that could be both technical, theoretical, but also in some sense speak to this larger time frame. And for that you need disciplines. You need different disciplines, and I think you need contributions from different parts of the kind of a wider knowledges, say, about AI, but also about film and about technology.
I think you make the point, that you kind of want to move AI beyond big tech. I think, and I take your point to mean both in terms of the debate around big tech, but also to understand that there are other stakeholders beyond big tech, and that AI shouldn't just be ceded to these companies. And I sometimes feel that in these debates we get bogged down into should an AI takeover be happening or should it not, and kind of ignore the fact that it is happening. And so what do we make of that, and how do we engage with it, whether we're happy about it or not? I'm wondering, when you set out to write a book on kind of a loaded topic, I would say, how do you, as like a scholar and writer and thinker of this, how do you, not to not to make it like a both sides issue, but how do you thread that needle, and how do you think about that?
Well, when I started, it wasn't such a hot topic. That's part of the reason it wasn't. It has become increasingly loaded over time, and in the media and so on. But I think for me, one of the aspirations anyway was to, I wouldn't say move it past big tech. I think it's really hard to ignore the influence and the power that big tech corporations hold over this. But one, it's also a sobering experience when you look at the technology and you also try to go beyond kind of popular discourse about this. So one example is the notion of a small large language models, for instance, right, or small large visual models. So this idea that only big tech can afford to train and use huge, because they involve a lot of computing and many hours of computing that are very expensive. You get these calculations that it costs millions of dollars to train a language model and so on. And that it's not that that isn't true, but it's also you can also see the reverse of that when you have these open source models like the ones that incredibly a company like Meta open sourced or Stability before them, and then you get a sense that there is a way of competing as well in different ways or in different terms by appealing to the open source community. Now, this could be rehashing the so-called tragedy of the commons. So you also have to wonder about the motivations that these companies have to open source these things. But the open sourcing of models has had an effect and has meant that you have partnerships, for example, that between universities, between private enterprise, but also between individual researchers that are now able to intervene in this technology and to use this technology. And the stakes of power are not as loaded as we think. I think that's and my hope is that by looking at these systems, we also get a glimpse of this, not of hopelessness against big tech, but actually of a desire to intervene. I think that would be my hope for in writing this, I suppose.
In thinking about AI, big technology, we hear a lot about algorithmic bias with regards to like race and gender. And in the book, you talk about encountering this, you and your colleagues, in your BBC project, with the big problem being that women were often misgendered in kind of the models that you were running. But you make the point in the book that we need to be cautionary in overcorrecting these issues vis-a-vis like bias in the society writ large, right? Could you talk more about that? Because I think it relates to what we're talking about here, and kind of there's no one-size-fits-all solution to a lot of these questions.
There is no technical solution to large social problems, right? So if the world is a racist world, it's important to address that as the problem, rather than thinking that somehow by fixing data sets we're going to fix that problem. This type of technical fix, or both a technical fix and a fixation on technical solutions, is partly what got us here in the first place with social media. And I think we risk repeating some of the worst aspects of social media in our relation with AI today. So this is partly why I was interested in thinking, well, where these biases, where did this come from? And bias itself is part of why these systems work. If these systems were not biased, they would not work in some sense, right? So it is, this notion of bias being a dirty word is also peculiar in that sense. We have loads of cognitive biases. If it wasn't because of our cognitive biases, we couldn't operate in the world. It's not the biases that are necessarily the problem, and there is, is the way that the structural inequalities of society that make these biases a system that oppresses some people and privileges other groups of people. So in that, AI is kind of stuck in the middle with all of these debates, and there is no. In my mind, there is not going to be a technical solution to this without a larger social solution, a political solution that obviously cuts through technology, and that is, but that is not technologically deterministic. So there, I'm not really sure if that answers your question on this, but back at the time when I was writing about this, so misgendering, not understanding, so for example, loads in machine vision, especially early on, you get very, very low rates of recognition of people of color. So you get all of these flaws in the system, right? But rather than looking at why this was the case, you're thinking about making data sets, or some tech companies are thinking about making data sets somehow artificially rebalance that. But that doesn't, that's in some sense is even more dangerous, because it can further conceal the structural inequalities rather than actually exposing them. So yeah, it cuts both ways. I suppose that was what I meant by when referring to biases.
And I want to remind everyone, because folks are still coming in, to please be thinking of questions for the end. I know we're kind of moving along. Lots to touch on different topics here quickly, and that the best question will get a prize. I want to pivot a little bit to kind of more of a question of aesthetics. One of the things that you mentioned in the book is, right, like at some point a bunch of images become a moving image, and then they have this aesthetic quality that we are then able to kind of identify as, you know, beautiful or powerful or moving. And that, you know, for some, kind of reducing, you know, what does reducing a moving image to a data set reveal about kind of that aesthetic power? And there's obviously debates, you know, vis-a-vis. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that for us in the audience, kind of the relationship between data and kind of our own sensorial experience of a film as an aesthetic object.
But I mean, this is one of the questions that animates the whole thing. Was that I was thinking, well, we have now many more digital moving images that we've ever had. We have access to digital files. Many movies, many films are now in digital form. In theory, we should be able to use computational methods to study and understand these moving images a lot better, right? This could be, and in practice, what I found is that it doesn't really, you know, work that way. At least not for now. There is a piece missing, I think, a piece that, for example, computational literary studies or computational linguistics has probably a bit of an advantage or a head start in that moving image studies doesn't have yet, which is probably a computational theory of a spectatorship, what it means to see a film. Many of these methods are concerned with the objects, right? They equal a film to a video file, and they try to find in a video file, in the frames, in the pixels, some kind of trace of what makes the object powerful or aesthetically pleasing or beautiful or whatever. And one part of that's missing from that equation is people who watch these films. The viewership is as important as the object itself. So film studies and media studies has understood this for a long time, and this is part of what animated me to do this. So part of the experiments that I present in the book are concerned with giving a computational body to some of the media theories about the spectatorship, about viewership, about how meaning arises from the contact that these objects have with their audiences at specific moments in history. And I think this idea of contact is quite important, and it's in some cases is an invisible thing, right? So it's I call it in the book at some point the invisible that makes the visible meaningful. And these invisible traces we're not looking for them. And there, you know, because up to recently only machine learning and computer people were looking into this as well. So as we expand and become more interdisciplinarian, other questions arise. Like, are there traces of how we watch films? Can we find these traces somewhere? How can we annotate the watching as well as the objects that are watched and so on? Of course, we have traces of the watching embedded in the objects, if you want, but we also have other traces that are not. So when you have these claims, for example, that we have computer vision now exceeds human vision, if you put a machine if you orient it towards a film, you immediately understand that it doesn't really exceed human vision at all at specific things. I'm trying to watch the way we watch and so on. So it's this notion of the what you count that counts, which is quite interesting. You start counting different things, you start looking for traces of different things, and then you can come up with different computer systems that are actually looking for other things that we weren't looking at before. And that's part of the gist of the critical technical logic of the book. So to give you one concrete example, so one of the chapters was about continuity. So I've become now a bit obsessed with understanding if we can model continuity editing and the notion of continuity, the concept of continuity in cinema, we can have ways of modeling that computationally. And it is a complicated problem because it is not just about finding the cuts and finding the mechanical trappings of the object. It's about understanding that how people watch is part of what makes that continuity continuous or discontinuous and so on. And for that, we don't have enough data. Paradoxically, we're flooded by data, but at the same time, we don't have that kind of data that we would need in order for having this type of aesthetically sensitive systems.
Mm. You draw on a lot of film theorists in your work. Particularly, you begin one chapter by talking about Andre Bazin and his excitement in his writings of the way that photography and, of course, cinema kind of gestured towards this kind of new realism in art. And I'm wondering, you also go into the history in the book of the photo lens and as its own type of machine vision. Could you talk about kind of the film theory traditions that kind of you see yourself building on in the book? I mean, I know there's quite a bit, but generally speaking, for any film theorists in the room, I said there's a couple. Yeah.
Maybe the easier way to answer that question is that a book comes to mind. So there's this wonderful book by Nicholas Ray called about how two theories diverged at some point, and he was talking about photogeny and kind of the Bella Ballas sort of ideas on that front, and then formalism, and then the Bordwell and the kind of stylistic film style historical poetics type of theory, and how they diverged at some point. And part of I guess in the back of my head I was thinking, well, maybe they can be reunited by AI in some sense. So for the film theorists out there, maybe that was, of course, in the book I also engaged with Marianne Doan's emergence of cinematic time, which also fascinates me. So I'm actually very ecumenical with my film theory. I think I don't really belong to any particular faction in that sense. I also don't think of myself as a film theorist very often, or at all these days, to be honest. But I still read as much as I can on that.
Well, you mentioned Marianne Doan had in this, her work on cinematic time. That to understand time and depict it, you have to somehow disrupt it in your depiction of it. Alter its flow, break it up into discrete units. One of the ways that you play with this in the book is an experiment on Jaws, in which there's that shot on the vertigo effect of Roy Schneider when he realizes the shark's in the water and the camera kind of dollies in on his face, and you recreate this with AI.
So it's a dolly zoom, which I love. I see them everywhere whenever I see them. So Jaws is the example I picked, but it's also Vertigo. It's very ubiquitous. It's this very interesting effect that happens when you zoom into something, but at the same time kind of pull the dolly outside. So you're moving out with the camera away from the subject, but you're zooming in with the lens into the subject. And what happens is a very disorienting effect in which the main subject, the figure in the frame, remains the same in size, but the background kind of warps, kind of distorts, and so I mean, people may be familiar with this as well. It is possible to replicate this with in-painting, with neural in-painting. At the time that I was writing that chapter, there was a couple of papers that came out on neural in-painting and fake camera movement using AI. So you could do dollies, you could do zooms, you could do, as long as it was camera movement, you could kind of replicate it without ever recording anything. And this is part of one of the chapters. It's about this notion of synthetic time, of time that is not the recording of anything, of any passage or any duration or any past duration, is synthesized, is time that it gets unrolled as a prediction. So it's time that is predicted time, instead of recording of past duration. And the effect is almost the same. So I put them side by side, and the dolly zoom effect is quite similar. But it's in a way is that the same thing that happens with digital images and celluloid, right? So they can look similar, but they ontologically they can be rather different. And this is, to me, in my mind, it was the same with AI. So you have these dolly zooms where you don't need a dolly and you don't need a zoom, and you're getting exactly or a very similar effect. Of course, now this is much more apparent in tools publicly available, right? To get the text to video prompts and the zooms that you can do by prompting them directly. Actually, I can show you one.
Sure.
Well, we do maybe the other follow-up. So I'll leave this playing, but you've probably seen this. So this is the OpenAI's Sora sort of idea, and all of these clips are AI generated. So there is no recording involved, or not recording at this point. There were many recordings involved that then allowed this kind of temporality to be unrolled. And so you have lots of, this is the prompt, and and then this is the video. Some of them work better than others. There is one about a three-legged cat and such mistakes that happen and so on. But the idea is the same. This type of time is not really a recorded time. So in the book I call it the thematic time. So for lack of a better expression. But anyway, I'll leave it running. It has no sound. But
and for the podcast listeners, imagining it's we're just playing this projecting behind us, but it looks like a reel of AI generated images. I'm wondering, like, you as an expert in this, like, what does it make you feel to be watching this? Because, like, for me, like, when I hear you talking about it, watching it, I definitely experience that kind of like uncanniness quality. But I'm wondering, like, do you become desensitized to that when you start studying this stuff? Like, how does it make you feel?
I mean, to me, this is interesting. For example, so you get this notion of trying to replicate historical footage, but at the same time, this is a drone-like. Right? So
we're going through the Old West.
It's very peculiar, and this is what happens with these images. They kind of challenge your preconceptions of, because this is not recorded, because it's and this allows you to mix and match all kinds of different concepts into imagery. Some of them are really long, right, and some of them are short and so on. But what makes me feel, I mean, some of these, what can I tell you? I mean, the notion of producing this type of imagery through text, I think, is quite exciting in some sense. But I also notice that, and this is probably just a professional thing, I notice, or I try to see or to imagine what types of data sets these were trained on. So for the previous one, it was clearly a lot of 3D animation, whereas many of these look to me like they're also stock image. Right, so you get loads of tourist board films and all this type of so if you say London or Mexico, whatever, you get a very prototypical flying view of a panorama of the sort of thing that you get in a tourist advertisement and so on. So yeah, what I feel is just the need to understand how they were trained, but I suppose that's not how everyone feels about them.
But I mean, it's useful to think about, and hopefully we'll all be thinking about that a little bit more now that we've had this talk. But I mean, one of the things that you talk about in the book is you use this example of the Borges story. There's a library that has every book in the world, and at first someone is very happy that they have access to every book in the world, but then at some point they kind of go mad and being overwhelmed. The same could be true for cinema. I think it's sometimes overstated how much access we have to every movie. Like, we actually don't, and there's a lot missing on the digital, but we have a lot more than we did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 50 years ago.
The Borges story is a cautionary tale in some sense.
Right.
La Biblioteca de Babel, the library of Bible, and you had this. People were super excited about having access to all the books ever written, but it has a really dark twist. People go mad, and then you have these factions that are created, and people who just different ways of approaching this vast infinity. And you're right, it's not infinite and it's not that vast.
Right.
But madness is definitely a part of it.
But you pose this thought in the book as, perhaps AI and its ability to go through all of these films, which are now a data set, could be a useful tool in that respect, and a guide. And you can never replace the role of the critic, I say, as it seemingly is, but I think it could be, could you speak to that kind of in getting back to AI's usefulness and what it presents as, more and more moving images are produced and scholars and fans try to make sense of?
I'll try to be succinct for a change. I think the way forward is through AI. I think it's inevitable that's we're going to need to contend with its existence, and that it's negotiating with AI that's going to be the challenge in the future, and with the different stakeholders that AI has. So in that sense, we cannot imagine the vast amount of cultural domains that we have and the cultural material that we have. Will not be able to deploy our regular critical faculties without at least considering that AI exists. Mm-hmm. We cannot go back to a pre-AI world in that sense, if that makes sense.
And in this part of the book, you also kind of pose the idea of AI as, what would it mean for AI to tell you if a film is good, for example, and to actually evaluate it in the way that a critic would or we as a viewer. How possible is this? And again, what are the implications of that as well?
I wrote a paper in 2021 called Building a Computational Critic. So maybe next year I'll have a computational version of you. It didn't work very well back then, and I don't think it'll work now. But I think we're still far away from aesthetic judgment or aesthetic experience evaluation. But that it is definitely, I can see a future there. But we're still a long way from that.
Mm-hmm. But we are, kind of keeping with this idea of AI as kind of the way forward and is the future. You put forward this idea of algorithmic filmmaking in the book, and some of the examples you use are experimental filmmakers of the avant-garde, Vertov, Frampton, Farocki, for example. And some of the most exciting work we know with AI right now is by experimental filmmakers, and we're increasingly seeing that kind of on the film festival circuit. What is algorithmic filmmaking as you understand it, or perhaps in another way, how do these kind of earlier experimental filmmaker traditions kind of feed what you're exploring here in this text?
One of the things that attracted me the most about the works of Hollis Frampton was that he was thinking algorithmically in before digital computers, in a sense. I think he did get to use digital computers, but his films are analog algorithms, and they are instantiations of algorithmic thinking in film. And I think if you think about that in those terms, this is an obvious connection with avant-garde cinema of that type. The notion that you get, especially that avant-garde cinema somehow has to be decoded in different ways than popular cinema does. It becomes naturally decoded in some sense. Mm-hmm. So solving that puzzle in some sense is looking for the algorithm that binds these films together, that makes these films that make the internal logic of these films. And Frampton, I thought, was very good at that. And so I spent some time in the book talking about his films, his algorithmic films. There is a whole other talk that we can do about avant-garde cinema and AI, I think.
I want to also ask you about videographic criticism or video essays, because it's something that comes up here in the book as an example of this algorithmic filmmaking. In particular, you talk about the supercut, which, for those who aren't familiar with supercut, it's like a video you might encounter on YouTube that maybe takes every single instance of something happening in a film and kind of stacks it, or in a television show or whatever. Like every time Tony Soprano says "Gabagool" or something in The Sopranos, right? And you pointed this as an example of algorithmic filmmaking. And I'm wondering what you make of the form of video essay I ask, selfishly, since that's what my podcast is about. Yeah. But yeah, please say more.
Well, I mean, the essay, films and videographic criticism that you usually get in your podcast is very sophisticated. It has very little to do with my very crude attempts at doing computational video essays, no? But then again, I mean, computational video, the computational video essays as a form is also very new, so I imagine there'll be better versions of it down the road and so on. But the notion for me of a computational video essay is one in which the person doing the essay is thinking computationally and through computers to perform this videographic criticism. So the thing that I find really interesting about videographic criticism is that it uses the medium as a way of doing the criticism. You're doing the criticism through the medium itself. And that's the same thing of critical coding, for example, or of creative computing in some sense as well. So the idea of the computational video essay is a hybrid of those. And I reviewed a couple, by the way, in Transition and other journals. So I'm sure there are out there, there will be people who will be doing this type of thing with AI and with computers more generally going forward.
You refer to the work of Catherine Grant in your book, who's kind of a pioneering videographic scholar, and she's put forward this idea of material thinking, in which someone who's making critical arguments and using moving images and sounds and making video essays rather than writing a written essay, for example, is thinking through the material, and that by the end result video kind of bears traces of that thinking. And you do something similar in your kind of more creative work that's very much, we saw the BBC series in this book, where these are bearing traces of your human thought through the AI generation. And that's kind of a constant that you make this point in the book that AI, even though it's AI, is always bearing traces of the human thinker that coded it.
Yes.
Correct? And so I'm wondering if you could, speak more to that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the more we get into this new phase of interfaces where you get things that are online, that you can prompt things, that you can get things directly kind of packaged as interfaces, the more you forget about the kind of the coding and the other aspects of the other technical aspects that went into it. So I think there is this window of opportunity where these things are not yet tethered to specific products or to specific, right? So it's more or less before they become Photoshop filters or right, that they are interesting in their own right as a very malleable thing that you can play with, that you can intervene. So in that sense, that's kind of the area, I guess, for this type of thinking. And we might be running out of time with the...
Yes, well, I know we started a little bit late, so I think now we should turn to questions from the audience who wants to win a prize. I don't mind, I can speak loud.
Thank you so much for the talk, really fascinating. Look forward to reading the book. I got a provocation. Should we forget cinema? That is the language of film studies appropriate anymore to study an object which actually is so foreign in the ways it's made, imagined, received, consumed, circulated? So is there a future for film studies, or should we just forget and move on to something else?
We should definitely not forget cinema. I think that's, and I think cinema will not forget us either. So in that sense, It's more about, but we need to reframe it. And one of the things that I mentioned in the book, one of the most interesting questions that I encountered when writing this was not really what cinema is or will be, but what its past would look like after these technologies. So it's this notion of having the world change in very few years that makes you re-examine what you thought the past of a medium was. So there are many questions there, I think, to be asked, and I think some of the language of traditional film studies will need to be updated, but many of its concepts are really valuable to study technology today. There's a very important strand in film studies about technology and about understanding the technological mediation of vision, and narrative. I'm not really sure if that answers all of your whole question, but.
Thank you. And thank you for being here. And following to that, how do you believe this is going to change the structure, the narrative, the way we tell a story? And second question, and how do you see creativity going? Because would you believe that maybe we feel a bit frustrated that we cannot perhaps come up with ideas so brilliant as it will come? What can you tell me about that, please?
Sorry, remind me, your first question was about
the structure, the narrative, like how you tell a story, will that change?
Yeah, I think it will, and I think it is already in some sense. So when they released the Sora clip, they released it with a clip of TED. They went into partnership with TED Talks, and they had this clip that was going to ask the professional filmmaker to use the system to create a trailer for the next 40 years of TED or something like that, and it's like an infinite zoom in with futuristic robots and lab-grown pieces of meat, and it's kind of a bit trippy, the whole thing. But one interesting thing is it has no apparent cuts, because the notion of cutting, the cut, is not really inbuilt very well into this. So you notice also from the example, they're self-contained clips. The notion of editing hasn't really been elaborated or computationally modeled. So it does suggest to me that it might, but it might also push us to a way of watching that's always very continuous, and that's always a bit like a Alexander Sokurov film that has a single take that never really uninterrupted. So I think both things are possible in terms of form, however, then think about language models and how they understand sequential sequences of words, and I think some of these same principles will eventually percolate to visual models as well. And you use like the BBC project, a lot better obviously, you get question sequences, reasonably well put together sequences of these clips. But this sequential thinking is in the making, I would say. So, and then to your second question about creativity, I think creativity is an interesting question to me, because we often confuse creativity with novelty, right? And so the fact that things are new do not necessarily make them creative in some sense. So you can have a random generator of numbers where every number will be completely, randomly generated from the previous one, and that will be always surprising, but it also would be very boring in some sense. However, randomness and noise play a very important role in the way these processes work. So you have hyperparameters, for example, in the case of language, like temperature, but also seed, different types of seeds, and a seed is just a number that represents where the model starts looking and traversing the data on which is trained. So these notions will play a significant role as well.
Thank you.
Hi, I read an article recently which is quite interesting about how language models which are trained on AI-generated data, like I suppose a sort of AI inbreeding, if you will, it created errors, a little bit like taking a screenshot of a screenshot, and it multiplied those errors. And there was a prediction at the end of the article suggesting that if you train AI on AI data again and again, it will make errors and it will become unrecognizable. But if you look at a film director who takes inspiration from another film director who took inspiration from a film director before them, we don't call that an error if they create their own original ideas which are nothing like their predecessors. We call that writer's voice or creative voice. Do you think that AI, the use of AI tools within cinema, do you think that there's potential for that to be classed as something which is original, to be classed as something more than just a tool, but like a sort of original voice?
One of the good things about being in a DH department is that we're told from very early on that a tool is never just a tool, right? So the tools, you shape the tool, but then the tool shapes you in some sense. So this is what's at stake as well. The synthetic imagery and the vast amount of synthetic imagery that's already out there will definitely have an effect. And will definitely, if it's used to retrain and so on, that will make significant changes to the availability and the diversity of possible images that are available at any given point. But it's also important to understand that these images were composite images anyway already. So when you think, for example, about video game footage, this is already rendered from a video game engine. And video game engines run on the same type of hardware that some of these models use. So these images were already the copy of the copy in some sense, or parametrically generated images. And we didn't really think that video games killed creativity or had this detrimental effect in visual culture. So I think the worst effects will not necessarily come from this idea of wildly multiplying types of images. There will be other effects, but maybe it will not be as terrible for creativity, I don't think.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk today. So when Sora got launched, I was a bit scared in terms of what's in it for an audience to go and watch a movie that's generated by AI. If I go and watch a movie, I pay for the creative side of a filmmaker or a cinematographer. What's your perspective on this? Thank you.
I mean, there is obviously, and this is not just in the creative industries or in cinema, I think it has hit the creative industries recently because they didn't think that this was a problem for them in some sense. But you know, I think two things. The creativity within these systems is not just at the press of the button. That's what you see at the very end, right? So you think this is definitely like easy in some sense. I just put something on the screen, I just prompt it, and then I get this image, right? So where is my cinematographer? Where is all the rest of it? But you also have to remember that for this to happen, for the system to be built, there's a lot of work that went into it. Credited work and uncredited work, and I think this is the fact that it's released at the push of a button is only the last part. Is in some sense is not that dissimilar to photography. So most of the heavy lifting of photography comes before you snap, right? Before you take the photograph, the photographer needs to get to that place in the first place. They need to pick the lens. There are loads of different choices that happens before you click. And I tend to think of this in the same way. There are many different types of choice that happen, and agencies and work that happens before you get to release these images at the click of a button. So perhaps we should be thinking not only about cinematographers and traditional film crews, but also about the kind of Pixar-like way about the technologies that are creating these tools as well, and also consider them as part of the creative process, because they will also, there's also a lot of creativity that goes into solving some of these technical problems. If that makes sense.
Hi. Sort of moving away from generative images and thinking more about computational filmmaking, maybe as a sort of like the BBC example of algorithmically editing together a bunch of clips in sequence with some sort of like content or thematic thread. Isn't that kind of what TikTok is doing? Like, I wonder how you see the experience of sitting and scrolling through TikTok for an hour. How does that compare to sort of sitting and watching a film? Or like, where does TikTok fit into sort of film theory or your thinking?
Well, the first thing to say is I'm not on TikTok. I know what it is. I've seen it. I've used it, but I'm not a part of it. What I can tell you is that many of these platforms, social media platforms, they are optimized for essentially for keeping you watching. They make their money out of keeping your attention and keeping you on them, right? And that's not exactly the same as what a film does. In some sense, a film has this kind of a very structured setting that allows you to get release from understanding a particular story, for example, if it's a narrative film that has a beginning and some kind of resolution and so on. TikTok doesn't really have a resolution because it's not designed for that. It's optimized for continuous watching. And that also makes it, in my mind, both a bit concerning and a bit dangerous if you want to, I don't want to say dangerous, but to the very least a bit concerning, but also not, aesthetically not that, is not really similar to having this type of algorithmically arranged film or algorithmic computational filmmaking, where you're trying to model the notion of having this narrative unfold. In some sense, it's a lot easier to keep people watching, because if you have enough of a history of watching, it can keep feeding you things that the algorithm will kind of work out that you're interested in, right? But the point with films is that they surprise you. They will not necessarily cater to you, and sometimes they will challenge you, and sometimes actually you will hate them. So all of these, the gamut of aesthetic experience that you can have with some of these films is quite broad. And that's not, in my mind, not the same as some of the social media feeds that tend to kind of narrow down to a very specific thing that they optimize for. It's difficult to optimize for pleasure. For example, if you understand pleasure of being not the same thing as just continuously liking something. So, liking and pleasure are not necessarily the same thing.
It's feeding an addictive cycle. It's feeding an addictive cycle.
It could be, yeah. I mean, yeah.
Rather than pleasure.
TikTok also is, I'm also not on TikTok. I say that not in a judgy way. But I think there's also some, like, the most creative young people are on TikTok making stuff. So it kind of has a similar, it kind of occupies a similar place as AI, where it's easy to get into the binary aspects of it. But I wonder, to ask about the TikTok question, I wonder how you see AI playing out for, like, people who are young now, who are, like, growing up with it, because the kind of the same is true for TikTok, where we have these people who are very much engaged in a remix culture of playing with images and sounds in this way, and it's kind of, their own vernacular is developing. What do you make of that, I guess, even just amongst your students, anecdotally, and their relationship with AI?
Yeah, well, I think our students, at least my students, they usually know a lot of things that I don't know, and about many things that are not as relevant as they think they are. And then I fail to notice many of the things that I think are relevant and turn out to be completely relevant to their own realities and world. So there is definitely, I suppose this is also the thing about growing up a little bit, that I grow old and then I get a bit more of a, generational distance with my students. The whole TikTok generation, I think, part of me thinks that if they don't see the algorithm, they're also missing out on a lot, right? So it's also the notion of packaging this as a end user system that, as you say, kind of creates a feedback loop that can become quite addictive, but at the same time, you're not really reasoning about many of the, it's not like avant-garde cinema in that sense. I mean, I sound really old now at this point, but it's just in which you try to solve the puzzle. You try to understand how this was made. TikTok doesn't really want you to understand how it is made, right? As far as I can tell, but maybe some young students will disagree.
Do we have time for maybe one more question? Right here? Sure.
Very interesting talk. I'm just following on from the TikTok discussion. I was just thinking, given TikTok and its short form video form of doing things, and the fact that people keep scrolling and it never seems to end, could it change the way films are made in the sense that, it's people don't really need to have an arc in the story, tension, resolution, conclusion, all that sort of thing, that sort of traditional structure.
What I would say is that people didn't need that earlier on either, no? So because we're thinking, here is where it helps, my kind of media film background helps as well, in the sense that we are talking about popular narrative cinema, which has this type of arc and this type of expectation and conventions to it. But that's not the only type of cinema in many ways, right? So there is also many different traditions that do not rely on this type of arc to work, and there are also different types of arcs according to different cultures. So you get this very classic Aristotelian three-point movement, right? But you also get the Japanese Kishotenketsu sort of structure, narrative structure, which is different, and it has its own logic to it, and so on. So it is culturally dependent, but it's also dependent on genre and on different types of cinema. So I don't think TikTok is as unique, I think, sometimes as people give it credit for.
I think now we can...
I'm not a TikTok hater, by the way.
We want that on the record. Well, thank you so much, Daniel. I think now we can do our book giveaway, but in the meantime, big round of applause for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.